Hello and welcome to the video. This is kind of a quick update and kind of a conclusion, I guess, to this series that I've been doing, linked down below. This is my first ever VTOL build, and when I started it, I've been pretty clear about the fact that this was kind of me figuring out what VTOL was all around from more of a hobby grade side, where I was trying to bolt on additional motors onto an existing frame that wasn't really designed for VTOL to create a 4+1 VTOL where it had the standard plane motor, but I was basically strapping a quadcopter onto it and trying to make it all work. Now, my VTOL journey this year started in January with this thing here. This is the OMP Hobby ZMO VTOL. Beautiful piece of kit. It's over £1,000. I think it was about 1,200 last time I looked. So it isn't cheap, but is a beautiful piece of kit. It has the tilt rotors at the front and an extra rotor on the tail at the back, so it becomes a tricopter when it's flying. Then in spring, I started to think about this stuff, and Ben up at 3DXR was incredibly generous and gave up a load of time where he showed all of the steps that he uses to create the professional UAV systems that he likes to build. And he's typically building those 4+1s where it is a standard plane with a quadcopter essentially bolted onto it. Now he's using top of the line equipment, things like the Pixhawk Cube Orange, things like the MFE Believer, the MFE Fighter, and those things are very, very high end if you're playing around the hobby. And by that point, I kind of had two things. I either had the very expensive stuff like the OMP Hobby VTOL that I just talked about, or we had the hobby grade, the toy grade stuff, that things like tail sitters that I'd had in as well. So I thought I kind of want to figure out how all this works. And I've come to a natural end with this series. I'm going to stop this series here, and I'll talk about what's coming next in a moment. But I've learned an awful lot from building this thing. There's a lot of things that you don't think about until you make your first VTOL and try and customize an existing fixed-wing model and add these motors on that you don't really think about until you're actually in the middle of it and you're constantly problem solving. The other reason for kind of drawing a line under it is that those tilt rotor style aircraft are becoming much more common now. This is the thing that I'll talk about at the end. This thing here is the Ranger T1 with a VTOL conversion kit. It has a motor on the tail and it has two tilt rotors at the front, and the tilt rotor is becoming much more common. A couple of weeks ago we looked at the Jumper Zake, still not sure you say that. Thank you to everyone that sent me lots of links of Chinese people saying that name. They should have given it a better name. That Zake 800 thing that I looked at a couple of weeks ago, that's only a couple of £100. It comes with a flight controller and it's all set up, but again, it's that tilt rotor. So I think tilt rotors are going to become more of a standard for the hobby grade VTOLs. So I think that's where I want to focus more on my efforts. And that's been reinforced by the fact that I've been talking to people like Andrew Tridgwell, or Tridge, who's one of the key Ardu Pilot developers. Very, very clever guy. And I was talking through what I was doing, and he's talked about the fact that actually, although 4-in-1s are the easiest to set up, that actually tilt rotors aren't particularly tricky either. So I was under the impression from the conversations that I had before I spoke to Andrew that tilt rotors were really hard work to get working well. But it turns out they're not really, and Ardu Pilot and Quadplane kind of has that sorted. The other issue that I came across when I was trying to move this Atom RC seal from being a regular fixed wing into a VTOL is that I am still struggling to try and create a very firm, stable, stiff platform for the quadcopter motors to sit on. There's still too much flex, and while some of that can be tuned out, having that flex in the wings just means that not only is it going to be pulling the motors up and down, it's going to be flexing the entire wings. That's going to change the flight characteristics and how that wing behaves in flight when you're in fixed wing as well during the transitions. It isn't ideal. Maybe I could have done a better job, maybe choosing a slightly smaller aircraft. And also, I think I probably undersized the motors and props a little bit. The build is starting to become extremely heavy, and I am concerned that the motors and props that I've chosen for the VTOL part just aren't up to snuff. But I don't think now, for lots of builders, there is going to be the desire to go and chop up an existing fixed-wing model with the amount of choice that we've got. We've got the high-end stuff like the OMP Hobby ZMO. We have things like the Jumper Zake 800, and we also now have things like the Ranger T1. The Ranger T1 conversion is going to run you about £344 by the time you put a flight controller and GPS in it. Things like the Jumper 800 are a couple of £100. So the parts alone on the build that I've been doing so far is going to cost you more than that. So in summary, what have I learned from this build? Well, first of all is that although the 4+1s are probably the easiest to set up and also provide you with some of the safest flying, they do provide a lot of extra weight on the model and then potentially not the most efficient way to do VTOL. I kind of knew that going in, but with the number of tilt rotors that are coming out now, it's kind of been rammed home that maybe it's a slightly inefficient way to do the VTOL stuff. I have learnt that those larger wings on planes like this that aren't designed to have the motors mounted on, you're going to have to really think about lots of carbon fiber plates and reinforcement to give yourself that firm mount so that things don't flex. The big thing I've learned through this entire build is all about how you match up the center of gravity of the multi-rotor part of the model, which provides the ascent and descent, the hovering part, with the central gravity as it works in a plane. All of that stuff has been incredibly interesting to me and stuff that I hadn't really figured out until I started playing. And it's not only the position of the motors front and back, but also having them tilted so that the attitude in a 4+1 is slightly nose up. But again, you don't have to worry about that in a tilt rotor. It is easy to underestimate the amount of thrust that you need and the overall weight of the model, particularly when you're running pretty thick, heavy power cables everywhere. And finally, because now there is so much more information around about tilt rotors, that's kind of what I want to do next. So for those of you that are interested in VTOL, I'm not stopping the journey. I'm kind of pressing pause on that 4+1 build. This is the series that's going to be starting over Christmas and probably early into the new year. Only 2 or 3 videos, maybe 3 or 4, only because I want to show how you put the VTOL kit onto this thing and all the tricks and tips that I figured out, and then how you wire it up to the flight controller and set that up, and some of the tips and tricks for maidening. I love the Ranger T1. It's a fantastic plane in its own right. It's one of my top 5 favourite fixed-wing models that I fly, and there are so many examples now of people that have kind of blazed the trail with the VTOL setup on things like this. It's a lot easier. So my series hopefully is going to provide all the links, all the information, step-by-step instructions. So if you do want to convert a Ranger T1 using the kit that is available, then you have a way to follow it and hopefully not get too lost. So it isn't the end of the VTOL building for me. VTOL, as I hoped at the beginning of the year, 2022 has been kind of the year of VTOL, and I think it's going to continue in 2023. So join me in that other series, and we'll get this thing finished with the props on, flight controller in, and we'll take it for a fly. Thank you for spending your time today watching that video. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you're trying to learn about a subject, then check out the playlist. All of my videos are organized into easy to follow playlists that if you're trying to learn a topic will take you from the basics right the way through to some pretty advanced stuff.